the food there. Everything is so good. I quite honestly can say I don't remember eating anything that I didn't really like. The strangest thing I ate was pork nose. But it was actually really good because it was just like a really salty, fatty meat. And it was just cut really thin. Looking at more like the differences you experience from going from either Germany to Austria, Austria to Germany. The Germans, they're kind of very order-oriented, like what's the rule, how are we going to follow it, who's responsible for this, 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 and this, and kind of very methodical in what they do. And then he talked about kind of the Italians and more the Spanish people and how they're pretty relaxed. They're kind of like, well, why should we do this? I mean, like, we can just relax. And then he talked about Austria was kind of a mix between the two. And I noticed that a lot, especially having first served in Austria and then going into Germany. The Austrians were a little bit more laid back than the Germans in their opinions. They still shared a lot of the traits with the Germans and like being pretty efficient in what they did. There was usually a pretty good order to how things went, but they were usually a little bit more laid back. I came to love both of them, of course. I mean, I can't. I love Germans, I love Austrians. Like, coming back to America after serving my mission was just like, Americans are so weird. I'd grown very used to just how the Germans did things. Like I said earlier, they're pretty private people, especially the Germans. In a work environment, it's kind of taboo to talk about personal subjects. There's definitely a difference between the older generation and the younger generation. The younger generation, they're a little bit more involved in kind of the world culture that has been developing over the last couple decades. There's kind of a specific order that things go in with Germans. You need to get to know them before they'll really open up to you. One thing that's very important to Germans is, your use of time. You should be on time. You should do what you say you're going to do. Be reliable and just make sure that you're honest. They will really admire that. They appreciate that honesty very much. And if you say you're going to do something, I said, do it. If you say you're going to be somewhere, be there at that time. Preferably early, but be there. With the language, to Americans, Germans typically sound pretty hard just because of their intonational patterns. We like to kind of raise and do all sorts of stuff with our intonation, whereas Germans is very flat. They seem to be void of emotion. That's a cultural thing. It's not true. Germans are awesome. With the language, they make up for expressing what we express through our tone of voice, through adding words and stuff like that. And so initially it may sound really harsh, but as you get to know the Germans, they're really a kind and a loving people who care for people. They're private, and so it doesn't really appear that they care for people, but if you're their friend, you're their friend for life. And they're going to do whatever they can for you. Their loyalty to their friends is something that I really admired when I was out there. I wouldn't say there's any huge differences in the Austrian and the German food. It's all pretty similar. Potatoes are kind of a big ingredient with a lot of the stuff. The potato starch they make noodles with, and one of my favorite foods is Knödel. It's a dumpling. In Austria, they'll do them primarily with potato starch, and they usually will fill them with like sausage or something like that. There's also dessert Knödel, which they fill with fruit and you eat with sugar. And then in Bayern and Baden-Württemberg, they're primarily made of bread. It's called Semmelknödel. Love it. It is so good. Oh. It was really good. Their bacon, I guess you can find the American bacon. You always find, what's one of the funniest things in Germany is, in all the stores you'll find the American section. And they have all these foods that they claim to be American foods that are just, they're not American, but they resemble American foods. You can find like the American style bacon, which is what we have. But they have their Schinken. It's usually smoked meat that's cut really thin, and that is fantastic. I love that. Main dishes, you'll eat a lot of Spätzle. It's a noodle. It is so good. One of the more popular dishes is Käsespätzle, which is just this noodle baked with a lot of cheese, and usually they'll do caramelized onions on top of it, and oh, it's so good. Then typically they'll serve it as also like a side, and you have gravy to put over it. The sausages, One thing I miss the most is just being able to walk into the supermarket and just have an entire section just dedicated to sausages. Everything is wonderful. In Bayern, one of the more popular ones is the Weisswurst, so the white sausage. That is fantastic. You eat it with sweet mustard, and you'll have Brezel, so soft pretzel, which is also really popular in Bayern. Some of my favorites was Rotkraut. It's a red sauerkraut. It's a little bit milder, a little bit sweeter. They usually have apples in with it, and it's really good. It's one of the other things I personally bought a lot of. I really liked it. Schupfnudel, I really like. It's a potato noodle. They're kind of long. The traditional way of serving them is with sauerkraut, and they're like real bacon bits. They're just chunks of bacon that they throw in there. It's just really good. One thing that's really popular in Austria in the fall especially is pumpkin soup. I love pumpkin soup. It is so good. They eat a lot of Italian food there as well, being pretty close there to Italy. And goulash is really good. They pull it from Hungary, and it's kind of a stew. Usually made with beef. That's really good. The dairy products out there are fantastic. I miss having the variety of cheese that you're able to get out there. You get some of the stronger cheeses, which I know not everyone likes, but you can adjust to them. If you end up in Switzerland, you will eat a lot of cheese. Christmas is awesome. I love Christmas in Germany. One of the big traditions that they have is the Christmas markets, the Weihnachtsmarkt. Every city will have one. I was in my third area, so Esslingen am Neckar, which is pretty close to Stuttgart. They have one of the more famous Christmas markets. Esslingen is a very old city. It was founded by Romans, and it was considered a emperor's city, and so it was very well protected throughout the years. And so they still have a lot of the old architecture that they've had, and they've restored it. And it has a very pretty old city in its center. And they do a medieval Christmas market. And so half of the Christmas market is just decked out like a medieval market. And as they have performers, they had fire dancers and a whole bunch of other performers from throughout Germany and wherever they could pull them from. That would just perform medieval music or medieval kind of themed things. And it was just really cool to see, just kind of get that cultural aspect of the Middle Ages coming in. In Germany, they have 3 Christmas days. They have Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and then the second Christmas holiday, so to say. Holidays are the Germans' personal time. You don't interrupt them on their holidays. My German got to a point where it was good enough that I started to be able to hear and understand the differences between the different dialects. The 2 I had the most experience with was Bäuerisch and Schwäbisch. My personal favorite is Schwäbisch. The intonation is a little bit more similar to Schweizerdeutsch, just because they're sitting a little bit closer to the Swiss border. They just kind of have this rise and fall, the Äffli und die Fehle, that just kind of runs throughout their dialect. You'll run into different words that are used by the different dialects, like in Schwäbisch, like to talk, to have a conversation with someone, mit jemand zu sprechen. They'd say mit jemand zu schwätzen, ein bisschen schwätzen. Switching over to Bayerisch. My impression of Bayerisch was they seemed to speak a little bit deeper in the throat. I don't know, it's difficult for me to explain the differences in the dialect just because I never really tried to speak the dialect all the time because I was supposed to speak Hochdeutsch, and my German was bad enough that I didn't need to try to go into the different dialects. Ihre Bayerisch was kind of like a typical phrase. I speak Bayerisch. Ihre Bayerisch. They shorten words, they conjugate their verbs a little bit less. And your R's, in German there's like 3 different R's you can use. You roll the R in the front of your mouth, you roll the R in the back of your mouth, and then there's like this really deep just R that you use. In Bayern, they roll all of their R's in the front. So Ihre Bayerisch, that's fun. I don't know why, I just really liked Schwäbisch, it just kind of had this fun sound to it. Schwäbisch is primarily spoken in Baden-Württemberg, in Schwabenland, as it's called. I think I'm mixing those 2 up. My geography is not the best, I'll admit that. It's hard to say exactly where the dialects kind of pick up and end and then switch to the next dialect, because in certain areas, each city can have its own dialect. It was a lot like that in my second area, in Haag. We're much more in the rural areas of Upper Austria, there was a different dialect for every single city. And then all the large cities tend to have kind of their own variation of the dialect, like I was saying. Vienna had Wienerisch, Salzburg you have Salzburgerisch, and then Munich you have Bayerisch, and then you go in more west, Stuttgart, into that area is where you hear more of the Slavish, or the Slavish and English and Swedish. And then in Switzerland is where you get the Swiss German, the Schweizerdeutsch, which, like I said earlier, is considered by most German-speaking people a completely different language. So, ich habe diese kleine Gelegenheit, ein kleines Botschaft, ein kleines Gedanke mit euch zu teilen. Zuerst ich sage, grüß euch, ich vermisse euch sehr. Es gibt fast keinen Tag, wo ich nicht an euch denke und den Einfluss, den sie auf mich gehabt haben,